It's episode 3 of Monroe County Civic Theater's Oc-Poe-ber Fest. Greetings, it's me, your friendly MC, Chili Billy Spears. Be my guest. For poems and stories, most odd and some gory, from the scare master Edgar A. Poe. Read by our troupe, a volunteer group of folks I'm sure some you know. Thanks to them all for answering the call to be part of this dark celebration every Saturday night when the pale moon is bright from now until October's cessation. That'll be Halloween. If you like what you've seen, grab a mask and come ring our bell. At www.mcct.org. We're all volunteers, so while you're here, why not help out? What the heck? At www.mcct.org/support. Now, on with the Poe. If it's not too hokey, let's do the pokey. When we left young Edgar, the tragedy of his personal losses was being complemented by the failure of his finances. He was never very lucky with money. Take his college days. In 1826, Poe left Richmond to attend the University of Virginia, where he excelled in his classes. And debt! His foster father, John Allen, sent him to college with less than a third of the funds he needed. So Poe soon took up gambling to raise money to pay for his expenses. Always a good idea, right? He and John constantly fought about his gambling debt and the cost of his education. After his foster mother's death, Poe dropped out of college. But to stay in the good graces of his father and to elude those he was indebted to, he enlisted in the Army. He was eventually promoted to the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could receive and was admitted to West Point. He served 2 years there before getting himself court-martialed for neglecting his military duties. Poe probably didn't mind. He may have even deliberately provoked his discharge because he wanted to pursue a literary career. He must have been popular because his West Point friends raised money to publish his new book of poetry. He began his book with, "To the U.S. Corps of Cadets, this volume is respectfully dedicated." Our first reading happens to be a poem. The Conqueror Worm was first published in 1843. Read by Hannah Jones Knight, it puts you in the audience of a grand theatrical spectacle. Just beware of the final act.
Lo, 'tis a gala night within the lonesome latter years, an angel throng, bewinged, bedight in veils and drowned in tears, sit in a theater to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in the form of God on high mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly mere puppets they who come and go at bidding of vast formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings invisible woe. That motley drama, oh be sure, it shall not be forgot, with its phantom chased for evermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth into the self-same spot, and much of madness,
and more of sin,
and horror, the soul of the plot. But see, amid the mimic rout, a crawling shape intrude, blood-red thing that writhes from out the scenic solitude. It writhes. With mortal pangs, the mimes become its food, and seraph sob at vermin fangs and human gore imbued. Out. Out are all the lights, out all. And over each quivering form, the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm. While the angels, all pallid and wan, uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy man, and its hero, the Conqueror.
Kenny Hertling brings us a short story that was first published in 1846. The Sphinx is about a man who decides to shelter at home with his cousin during a cholera epidemic. Sound familiar? It begins to affect his mind. Sound familiar? One day, while reading a book near a window, he has a painful experience.
During the dread reign of the cholera in New York, I had accepted the invitation of a relative to spend a fortnight with him in the retirement of his cottage ornée on the banks of the Hudson. We had here around us all the ordinary means of summer amusement, and what with rambling in the woods, sketching, boating, fishing, bathing, music, and books, we should have passed the time pleasantly enough, but for the fearful intelligence which reached us every morning from the populous city. Not a day elapsed which did not bring us news of the decease of some acquaintance. Then, as the fatality increased, we learned to expect daily the loss of some friend. At length we trembled at the approach of every messenger. The very air from the south seemed to us redolent with death. The palsying thought indeed took entire possession of my soul. I could neither speak, think, nor dream of anything else. My host was of a less excitable temperament, and although greatly depressed in spirits, exerted himself to sustain my own. His richly philosophical intellect was not at any time affected by unrealities. To the substances of terror he was sufficiently alive, but of its shadows he had no apprehension. His endeavors to arouse me from the condition of abnormal gloom into which I had fallen were frustrated in great measure by certain volumes which I had found in his library. These were of a character to force into germination whatever seeds of hereditary superstition lay latent in my bosom. I had been reading these books without his knowledge, and thus he was often at a loss to account for the forcible impressions which had been made upon my fancy. A favorite topic with me was the popular belief in omens, a belief which, at this one epoch in my life, I was almost seriously disposed to defend. On this subject we had long and animated discussions, he maintaining the utter groundlessness of faith in such matters, I contending that a popular sentiment arising with absolute spontaneity, that is to say without apparent traces of suggestion, had, in itself, the unmistakable elements of truth, and was entitled to as much respect as that intuition which is the idiosyncrasy of the individual man of genius. The fact is that soon after my arrival at the cottage there had occurred to myself an incident so entirely inexplicable, and which had in it so much of the portentous character that I might well have been excused for regarding it as an omen. It appalled and at the same time so confounded and bewildered me that many days elapsed before I could make up my mind to communicate the circumstances to my friend. Near the close of an exceedingly warm day, I was sitting, book in hand, at an open window, commanding, through a long vista of the river banks, a view of a distant hill, the face of which nearest my position had been denuded by what is termed a landslide of the principal portion of its trees. My thoughts had been long wandering from the volume before me to the gloom and desolation of the neighboring city. Upon lifting my eyes from the page, they fell upon the naked face of the hill, and upon an object, upon some living monster of hideous conformation, which very rapidly made its way from the summit to the bottom, disappearing finally in the dense forest below. As this creature first came in sight, I doubted my own sanity, or at least the evidence of my own eyes, and many minutes passed before I succeeded in convincing myself that I was neither mad nor in a dream. Yet when I described the monster, which I distinctly saw and calmly surveyed through the whole period of its progress. My readers, I fear, will feel more difficulty in being convinced of these points than even I did myself. Estimating the size of the creature by comparison with the diameter of the large trees near which it had passed, the few giants of the forest which had escaped the fury of the landslide, I concluded it to be far larger than any ship of the line in existence. I say ship of the line because the shape of the monster suggested the idea the hull of one of our 74s might convey a very tolerable conception of the general outline. The mouth of the animal was situated at the extremity of a proboscis some 60 or 70 feet in length and about as thick as the body of an ordinary elephant. Near the root of this trunk was an immense quantity of black, shaggy hair, more than could have been supplied by the coats of a score of buffaloes. And projecting from this hair downwardly and laterally sprang two gleaming tusks, not unlike those of the wild boar, but of infinitely greater dimension. Extending forward, parallel with the proboscis, and on each side of it was a gigantic staff, 30 or 40 feet in length, formed seemingly of pure crystal, and in shape a perfect prism. It reflected in the most gorgeous manner the rays of the declining sun. The trunk was fashioned like a wedge with the apex to the earth. From it there were outspread 2 pairs of wings, each wing nearly 100 yards in length, one pair being placed above the other, and all thickly covered with metal scales, each scale apparently some 10 or 12 feet in diameter. I observed that the upper and lower tiers of wings were connected by a strong chain, but the chief peculiarity of this horrible thing was the representation of a death's head which covered nearly the whole surface of its breast, and which was as accurately traced in glaring white upon the dark ground of the body as if it had been there carefully designed by an artist. While I regarded this terrific animal, and more especially the appearance on its breast, with a feeling of horror and awe, with a sentiment of forthcoming evil which I found it impossible to quell by any effort of the reason, I perceived the huge jaws at the extremity of the proboscis suddenly expand themselves, and from them there proceeded a sound so loud and so expressive of woe that it stuck upon my nerves like a knell. And as the monster disappeared at the foot of the hill, I fell at once, fainting, to the floor. Upon recovering, my first impulse, of course, was to inform my friend of what I had seen and heard, and I can scarcely explain what feeling of repugnance it was which in the end operated to prevent me. At length, one evening, some 3 or 4 days after the occurrence, we were sitting together in the room in which I had seen the apparition, I occupying the same seat at the same window, and he lounging on a sofa near at hand. The association of the place and time impelled me to give him an account of the phenomenon. He heard me to the end, at first laughed heartily, and then lapsed into an excessively grave demeanor, as if my insanity was a thing beyond suspicion. At this instant I again had a distinct view of the monster, to which, with a shout of absolute terror, I now directed his attention. He looked eagerly, but maintained that he saw nothing, although I designated minutely the course of the creature as it made its way down the naked face of the hill. I was now immeasurably alarmed, for I considered the vision either as an omen of my death, or worse, as the forerunner of an attack of mania. I threw myself passionately back in my chair, and for some moments buried my face in my hands. When I uncovered my eyes, the apparition was no longer apparent. My host, however, had in some degree resumed the calmness of his demeanor, and questioned me very vigorously in respect to the conformation of the visionary creature. When I had fully satisfied him on this head, he sighed deeply, as if relieved of some intolerable burden, and went on to talk with what I thought a cruel calmness of various points of speculative philosophy, which had heretofore formed subject of discussion between us. I remember his insisting very especially, among other things, upon the idea that a principal source of error in all human investigations lay in the liability of the understanding to underrate or to overvalue the importance of an object through mere misadmeasurement of its propinquity. To estimate properly, for example, he said, the influence to be exercised on mankind at large by the thorough diffusion of democracy, the distance of the epoch at which such diffusion may possibly be accomplished should not fail to form an item in the estimate. Yet, can you tell me one writer on the subject of government who has ever thought this particular branch of the subject worthy of discussion at all? He here paused for a moment, stepped to a bookcase, and brought forth one of the ordinary synopses of natural history, requesting me to then exchange seats with him, that he might better distinguish the fine print of the volume. He took my armchair at the window, and, opening the book, resumed his discourse very much in the same tone as before. "But for your exceeding minuteness," he said, "in describing the monster, I might never have had it in my power to demonstrate to you what it was. In the first place, let me read to you a schoolboy account of the genus Sphinx, of the family Crepuscular, of the order Lepidoptera, of the class of Insecta, or insects. The account runs thus: 4 membranous wings covered with little colored scales of a metallic appearance, mouth forming a rolled proboscis produced by elongation of the jaws, upon the sides of which are found the rudiments of mandibles and downy palpi, the inferior wings retained to the superior by a stiff hair, antenna in the form of an elongated club, prismatic, abdomen pointed. The death's head sphinx has occasioned much terror among the vulgar, at times by the melancholy kind of cry which it utters, and the insignia of death which it wears upon its corslet." He here closed the book and leaned forward in the chair, placing himself accurately in the position which I had occupied at the moment of beholding the monster. "Ah, here it is!" he presently exclaimed. "It is reascending the face of the hill, and a very remarkable looking creature, I admit it be. Still, it is by no means so large or so distant as you imagined it. For the fact is that, as it wriggles its way up this hair, which some spider has wrought along the window sash, I find it to be about the 16th of an inch in its extreme length, and also about the 16th of an inch distant from the pupil of my eye."
Our next reading is a short story first published in 1843. The narrator describes how he's committed the perfect crime of murder through careful calculation. He also tries to prove his sanity to us, but it just doesn't add up. He's wrong on both counts. Here's Sarah May Ruggles reading The Telltale Heart.
It's true. Yes, I have been ill. Very ill. But why do you say that I have lost control of my mind? Why do you say that I am mad? Can you not see that I have full control of my mind? Is it not clear that I am not mad? Indeed, the illness only made my mind, my feelings, my senses stronger, more powerful. My sense of hearing especially became more powerful. I could hear sounds I had never heard before. I heard sounds from heaven, and I heard sounds from hell. Listen. Listen, and I will tell you how it happened. You will see. You will hear how healthy my mind is. It is impossible to say how the idea first entered my head. There was no reason for what I did. I did not hate the old man. I even loved him. He had never hurt me. I did not want his money. I think it was his eye. His eye was like the eye of a vulture, the eye of one of those terrible birds that watch and wait while an animal dies, and then fall upon the dead body and pull it to pieces to eat it. When the old man looked at me with his vulture eye, a cold feeling went up and down my back. Even my blood became cold. And so I finally decided I had to kill the old man and close that eye forever. So you think that I am mad? A madman cannot plan. But you should have seen me. During all of that week, I was as friendly to the old man as I could be, and warm and loving. Every night, about 12 o'clock, I slowly opened his door. And when the door was opened wide enough, I put my hand in, and then my head. In my hand, I held the light covered over with a cloth so that no light showed. And I stood there, quietly. Then, carefully, I lifted the cloth, just a little, so that a single, thin, small light fell across that eye. For 7 nights I did this. 7 long nights, every night at midnight. Always the eye was closed, so it was impossible for me to do the work. For it was not the old man I felt I had to kill. It was the eye, his evil eye. And every morning I went to his room, and with a warm, friendly voice I asked him how he had slept. He could not guess that every night, just at 12, I looked in at him as he slept. The 8th night, I was more than usually careful as I opened the door. The hands of a clock move more quickly than did my hand. Never before had I felt so strongly my own power. I was now sure of success. The old man was lying there, not dreaming that I was at his door. Suddenly, he moved in his bed. You may think I became afraid, but no. The darkness in his room was thick and black. I knew he could not see the opening of the door. I continued to push the door slowly, softly. I put in my head. I put in my hand with the covered light. Suddenly, the old man sat straight up in bed and cried, "Who's there?" I stood quite still. For a whole hour I did not move, nor did I hear him again lie down in his bed. He just sat there, listening. Then I heard a sound, a low cry of fear which escaped from the old man. Now I knew that he was sitting up in his bed, filled with fear. I knew that he knew that I was there. He did not see me there. He could not hear me there. He felt me there. Now he knew that death was standing there. Slowly, little by little, I lifted the cloth until a small, small light escaped from under it to fall upon that vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and my anger increased as it looked straight at me. I could not see the old man's face, only that eye. That hard blue eye, and the blood in my body became like ice. Have I not told you that my hearing had become unusually strong? Now I could hear a quick, low, soft sound, like the sound of a clock heard through a wall. It was the beating of the old man's heart. I tried to stand quietly, but the sound grew louder. The old man's fear must have been great indeed. And as the sound grew louder, my anger became greater and more painful. But it was more than anger. In the quiet night, in the dark silence of the bedroom, my anger became fear, for the heart was beating so loudly that I was sure someone must hear. The time had come. I rushed into the room, crying, "Die! Die!" The old man gave a loud cry of fear as I fell upon him and held the bedcovers tightly over his head. Still his heart was beating, but I smiled as I felt that success was near. For many minutes that heart continued to beat, but at last the beating stopped. The old man was dead. I took away the bedcovers and held my ear over his heart. There was no sound. Yes, he was dead, dead as a stone. His eye would trouble me no more. So I am mad, you say. You should have seen how careful I was to put the body where no one could find it. First, I cut off the head, then the arms and the legs. I was careful not to let a single drop of blood fall on the floor. I pulled up 3 of the boards that formed the floor and put the pieces of the body there. Then I put the boards down again, carefully, so carefully that no human eye could see that they had been moved. As I finished this work, I heard that someone was at the door. It was now 4 o'clock in the morning, but still dark. I had no fear, however, as I went down to open the door. 3 men were at the door, 3 officers of the police. One of the neighbors had heard the old man's cry and had called the police. These 3 had come to ask questions and to search the house. I asked the policemen to come in. The cry, I said, was my own, in a dream. The old man, I said, was away. He had gone to visit a friend in the country. I took them through the whole house, telling them to search it all, to search well. I led them finally into the old man's bedroom. As if playing a game with them, I asked them to sit down and talk for a while. My easy, quiet manner made the policemen believe my story, so they sat talking with me in a friendly way. But although I answered them in the same way, I soon wished that they would go. My head hurt, and there was a strange sound in my ears. I talked more and faster. The sound became clearer, and still they sat and talked. Suddenly, I knew that the sound was not in my ears. It was not just inside my head. At that moment, I must have become quite white. I talked still faster and louder, and the sound too became louder. It was a quick, low, soft sound, like the sound of a clock heard through a wall, a sound I knew well. Louder it became, and louder. Why did the men not go? Louder, louder. I stood up and walked quickly around the room. I pushed my chair across the floor to make more noise, to cover that terrible sound. I talked even louder, and still the men sat and talked and smiled. Was it possible that they could not hear? No, they heard. I was certain of it. They knew. Now it was they who were playing a game with me. I was suffering more than I could bear from their smiles and from that sound. Louder, louder, louder. Suddenly I could bear it no longer. I pointed at the boards and cried, "Yes! Yes, I killed him! Pull up the boards and you shall see. I killed him. But why does his heart not stop beating? Why does it not stop?"
We'll conclude this episode with a reading by Jessica Marchbank McCanse called Eleonora. The narrator falls in love with Eleonora. The valley they live in reflects the beauty of their love. She, however, becomes deathly ill. I wonder where that came from. It's another story with similarities to Poe's relationship with Virginia Clem. Here's Eleonora.
I am come of a race noted for vigor of fancy and ardor of passion. Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled, whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound, does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect. They who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only at night. In their gray visions, they obtain glimpses of eternity and thrill in wakening to find that they have been upon the verge of the great secret. In snatches, they learn something of the wisdom which is of good, and more of the mere knowledge which is of evil. They penetrate, however rudderless or compassless, into the vast ocean of the light ineffable, and again, like the adventures of the Nubian geographer, aggressi sunt mare tenebrarum, quid in eo esset exploraturi. We will say then that I am mad. I grant, at least, that there are two distinct conditions of my mental existence. The condition of a lucid reason, not to be disputed, and belonging to the memory of events forming the first epoch of my life, and a condition of shadow and doubt appertaining to the present, and to the recollection of what constitutes the second great era of my being. Therefore, what I shall tell of the earlier period, believe, and to what I may relate of the later time, give only such credit as may seem due, or doubt it altogether, or, if doubt it ye cannot, then play unto its riddle, the Oedipus. She whom I loved in youth, and of whom I now pen calmly and distinctly these remembrances, was the sole daughter of the only sister of my mother, long departed. Eleonora was the name of my cousin. We had always dwelled together beneath the tropical sun in the valley of the many-colored grass. No unguided footstep ever came upon that vale, for it lay away up among a range of giant hills that hung beetling around about it, shutting out the sunlight from its sweetest recesses. No path was trodden in its vicinity, and to reach our happy home, there was need of putting back with force the foliage of many thousands of forest trees, and of crushing to death the glories of many millions of fragrant flowers. Thus it was that we lived all alone, knowing nothing of the world without the valley, I and my cousin and her mother. From the dim regions beyond the mountains, the upper end of our encircled domain, there crept out a narrow and deep river, brighter than all save the eyes of Eleonora, and, winding stealthily about in mazy courses, it passed away, at length, through a shadowy gorge, among hills still dimmer than those whence it had issued. We called it the River of Silence, for there seemed to be a hushing influence in its flow. No murmur arose from its bed, and so gently it wandered along, that the pearly pebbles upon which we loved to gaze, far down within its bosom, stirred not at all, but lay in a motionless content, each in its own old station, shining on gloriously forever. The margin of the river, and of the many dazzling rivulets that glided through the devious ways into its channel, as well as the spaces that extended from the margins away down into the depths of the streams until they reached the bed of pebbles at the bottom. These spots, not less than the whole surface of the valley, from the river to the mountains that girdled it in, were carpeted all by a soft green grass, thick, short, perfectly even, and vanilla perfumed, but so besprinkled throughout with the yellow buttercup, the white daisy, the purple violet, and the ruby red asphodel, that its exceeding beauty spoke to our hearts in loud tones of the love and of the glory of God. And, here and there, in groves about this grass, like wildernesses of dreams, sprang up fantastic trees whose tall, slender stems stood not upright, but slanted gracefully toward the light that peered at noonday into the center of the valley. Their mark was speckled with the vivid alternate splendor of ebony and silver, and was smoother than all save the cheeks of Eleonora, so that, but for the brilliant green of the huge leaves that spread from their summits in long, tremulous lines, dallying with the zephyrs, one might have fancied them giant serpents of Syria, doing homage to their sovereign, the sun. Hand in hand about this valley for 15 years roamed I with Eleonora before love entered within our hearts. It was one evening at the close of the 3rd lustrum of her life, and of the 4th of my own, that we sat, locked in each other's embrace, beneath the serpent-like trees, and looked down within the water of the river of silence at our images therein. We spoke no words during the rest of that sweet day, and our words even upon the morrow were tremulous and few. We had drawn the god Eros from that wave, and now we felt that he had enkindled within us the fiery souls of our forefathers. The passions which had for centuries distinguished our race came thronging with the fancies for which they had been equally noted, and together breathed delirious bliss over the valley of the many-colored grass. A change fell upon all things. Strange, brilliant flowers, star-shaped, burned out upon the trees where no flowers had been known before. The tints of the green carpet deepened, and when, one by one, the white daisies shrank away, there sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 of the ruby-red asphodel, and life arose in our paths, for the tall flamingo, hitherto unseen, with all gay, glowing birds, flaunted his scarlet plumage before us. The golden and silver fish haunted the river, out of the bosom of which issued, little by little, a murmur that swelled at length into a lulling melody more divine than that of the harp of Aeolus, sweeter than all save the voice of Eleonora. And now, too, a voluminous cloud, which we had long watched in the regions of Hesper, floated out thence, all gorgeous in crimson and gold, and settling in peace above us, sank, day by day, lower and lower, until its edges rested upon the tops of the mountains, turning all their dimness into magnificence, and shutting us up, as if forever, within a magic prison house of grandeur and glory. The loveliness of Eleonora was that of the seraphim, but she was a maiden artless and innocent as the brief life she had led among the flowers. No guile disguised the fervor of love which animated her heart, and she examined with me its inmost recesses as we walked together in the valley of the many-colored grass, and discoursed of the mighty changes which had lately taken place therein. At length, having spoken one day in tears of the last sad change which must befall humanity, she thenceforward dwelt only upon this one sorrowful theme, interweaving it into all our converse, as in the songs of the bard of Shiraz, the same images are found occurring, again and again in every impressive variation of phrase. She had seen that the finger of death was upon her bosom, that, like the ephemeron, she had been made perfect in loveliness only to die. But the terrors of the grave to her lay solely in a consideration which she revealed to me one evening at twilight, by the banks of the River of Silence. She grieved to think that, having entombed her in the valley of the many-colored grass, I would quit forever its happy recesses, transferring the love which now was so passionately her own to some maiden of the outer and everyday world. And then and there, I threw myself hurriedly at the feet of Eleonora and offered up a vow to herself and to heaven that I would never bind myself in marriage to any daughter of earth, that I would in no manner prove recreant to her dear memory, or to the memory of the devout affection with which she had blessed me. And I called the mighty ruler of the universe to witness the pious solemnity of my vow, and the curse which I invoked of him and of her, a saint in Elysium, should I prove traitorous to that promise, involved a penalty the exceeding great horror of which will not permit me to make record of it here. And the bright eyes of Eleonora grew brighter at my words, and she sighed as if a deadly burden had been taken from her breast, and she trembled and very bitterly wept. But she made acceptance of the vow, for what was she but a child? And it made easy to her the bed of her death. And she said to me, not many days afterward, tranquilly dying, that because of what I had done for the comfort of her spirit, she would watch over me in that spirit when departed. And if so it were permitted, her return to me visibly in the watches of the night. But if this thing were indeed beyond the power of the souls in paradise, that she would at least give me frequent indications of her presence, sighing upon me in the evening winds, or filling the air which I breathed with perfume from the censers of the angels. And with these words upon her lips, she yielded up her innocent life, putting an end to the first epic of my own. Thus far I have faithfully said, but as I pass the barrier in time's path, formed by the death of my beloved, and proceed with the second era of my existence, I feel that a shadow gathers over my brain, and I mistrust the perfect sanity of the record. But let me on. Years drag themselves along heavily, and still I dwelled within the valley of the many-colored grass. But a second change had come upon all things. The star-shaped flowers shrank into the stems of the trees and appeared no more. The tints of the green carpet faded, and one by one, the ruby-red asphodels withered away, and there sprang up, in place of them, 10 by 10, dark, eye-like violets, that writhed uneasily and were ever encumbered with dew. And life departed from our paths, for the tall flamingo flaunted no longer his scarlet plumage before us, but flew sadly from the vale into the hills, with all the gay glowing birds that had arrived in his company, and the golden and silver fish swam down through the gorge at the lower end of our domain, and bedecked the sweet river never again. And the lulling melody that had been softer than the wind harp of Aeolus, and more divine than all save the voice of Eleonora, it died little by little away, in murmurs growing lower and lower, until the stream returned at length utterly into the solemnity of its original silence. And then, lastly, the voluminous cloud uprose, and, abandoning the tops of the mountains to the dimness of old, fell back into the regions of Hesper, and took away all its manifold golden and gorgeous glories from the valley of the many-colored grass. Yet the promises of Eleonora were not forgotten, for I heard the sounds of the swinging of the censers of the angels, and streams of a holy perfume floated ever and ever about the valley. And at lone hours, when my heart beat heavily, the winds that bathed my brow came unto me laden with soft sighs, and indistinct murmurs filled often the night air. And once, but once only, I was awakened from a slumber, like the slumber of death, by the pressing of spiritual lips upon my own. But the void within my heart refused, even thus, to be filled. I longed for the love which had before filled it to overflowing. At length the valley pained me through its memories of Eleonora, and I left it forever for the vanities and the turbulent triumphs of the world. I found myself within a strange city, where all things might have served to blot from recollection the sweet dreams I had dreamed so long in the valley of the many-colored grass. The pomps and pageantries of a stately court, and the mad clangor of arms, and the radiant loveliness of women, bewildered and intoxicated my brain. But as yet my soul had proved true to its vows, and the indications of the presence of Eleonora were still given me in the silent hours of the night. Suddenly these manifestations, they ceased, and the world grew dark before mine eyes. And I stood aghast at the burning thoughts which possessed, at the terrible temptations which beset me, for there came from some far, far distant and unknown land into the gay court of the king I served, a maiden to whose beauty my whole recreant heart yielded at once, at whose footstool I bowed down without a struggle, in the most ardent and the most abject worship of love. What, indeed, was my passion for the young girl of the valley in comparison with the fervor and the delirium and the spirit-lifting ecstasy of adoration with which I poured out my whole soul in tears at the feet of the ethereal Ermengarde? Oh, bright was the seraph Ermengarde, and in that knowledge I had room for none other. Oh, divine was the angel Ermengarde, and as I looked down into the depths of her memorial eyes, I thought only of them, and of her. I wedded, nor dreaded the curse I had invoked, and its bitterness was not visited upon me. And once, but once again in the silence of the night, there came through my lattice the soft sighs which had forsaken me, and they modeled themselves into familiar and sweet voice, saying, "Sleep in peace, for the spirit of love reigneth and ruleth, and, in taking to thy passionate heart her who is Ermengarde, thou art absolved, for reasons which shall be made known to thee in heaven, of thy vows unto Eleonora."
Wow! What was that? A happy ending? Hard to believe, but it's also time for me to leave. Thanks for listening. Remember, we'll be bringing you a new episode every Saturday this October as part of MCCT's Oc-Poe-ber Fest celebration. Evermore, evermore. Until the next time, sleep tight. And if you hear something go bump in the night, perhaps it's just the Sphinx of the family Crepuscularia of the order Lepidoptera of the class Insecta on your window pane. Or not.